Today we are reading a story called Lunch Money, which is located in your reading book on page 483. This is a realistic fiction story, which means it has characters and events that could really happen, like real people. And the setting is familiar to most readers. Main character who is going to overcome a challenge, and then everything that happens with that character, the thoughts and the actions, they're believable. Standing in the cafeteria line, Greg opened his red plastic pencil case. He counted once and then counted again just to be sure. And then he grinned. There were 13 left. Sweet! That means I sold 17 units. That's what Greg called the comic books that he'd been selling, units. And selling 17 units before lunch was a new sales record. Greg's comic books weren't the kind for sale at stores. Now, regular comic books, they were sort of tall, also a little floppy. Not Greg's. Greg's comic books were about the size of a credit card, and they could stand up on one end all by themselves. They were only 16 pages long, and he could fit about 50 of them into his pencil case. These comic books were short, sturdy, and that's why they were called Chunky Comics. Greg loved that name. He's chosen it himself. He got to pick the name because he was the author of all Chunky Comic stories. He had drawn all the pictures too, and he was also the designer, the printer, and the binder. Plus, he was the marketing manager, the advertising director, and the entire sales force. Chunky Comics was a one-kid operation, and that one kid was Greg Kenton. Greg snapped the pencil case shut and grabbed a tray. He took a grilled cheese sandwich, a cup of carrot sticks, and looked over the fruit cocktail bowls until he found one with 3 chunks of cherry. He got a chocolate milk from the cooler and walked towards his seat. Greg did some mental math. Monday, the first day of Chunky Comics, had gone on sale. He had sold 12 units. Tuesday, 15 units. Wednesday, 18 units. And today, Thursday, he had already sold 17 units before lunch. So that was 62 units since Monday morning. And each little book sold for 25 cents. So the up to the minute sales total for September 12th was $15.50. Greg knew why sales were increasing. Word of mouth. Kids had been telling other kids about his comic book. The cover illustration was powerful and the inside pictures were strong. And the story was loaded with action. The title was Crayon, Return of the Hunter. And it was volume 1, number 1, the very first of the Chunky Comics. So that made it a collector's item. Greg sat down at his regular lunch table next to Ted Kendall. Ted nodded and said, "Hi." But Greg didn't hear him. Greg picked up his sandwich and took a big old bite. He chewed the warm bread and the soft cheese, and he didn't taste a thing. Greg was still thinking about sales. Okay, 15.50 in 3.5 days, not so hot. Greg had set a sales goal the first week, $25, which meant that he had to sell 100 units. It looked like he was going to fall short. The idea of making and selling comic books had hit Greg like a crack over the head from Superman himself. It made perfect sense. Candy and gum were against school rules, and tiny toys were boring and also against the rules. But how could he go wrong selling little books? School was all about books and reading. True, reading a comic book wasn't exactly the same as reading a regular book, but still, there was a rack of comics right in the kids section at the public library downtown, and some new graphic novels too. Comic books had been part of Greg's life forever, mostly because of his dad's collection. His dad's collection filled 3 shelves in the family room, and it was worth over $10,000. Once Greg had shown that he knew how to take care of comic books, and he'd been allowed to read and look at them all he wanted. Greg had even bought a few collectible comics of his own, mostly newer ones, and they weren't very expensive. It was his love of comic books that had first gotten Greg interested in drawing. Comics had had led Greg to books like How Do You Draw Comic Book Villains? How Can You Draw Superheroes? Make Your Own Comic Book Art and Draw the Monsters That We Love to Hate. Back in third grade, Greg used his own money to buy India ink, dip pens, brushes, and paper at the art supply store. And drawing new comic book characters was one of his favorite things to do when he wasn't earning money. That whole summer before sixth grade, Grade had worked towards the launch of Chunky Comics. From the start, he had felt pretty sure that he could come up with a story idea, and he knew that he would be able to do the drawings. But first, he had to deal with a lot of hows. How does a whole comic book get put together? How big should each be? How was he going to print them? How much would it cost him to make each one? And finally, how much money would he charge for his finished comic books, assuming that he could actually make some? But one by one, Greg had found the answers. An encyclopedia article about printing books helped a lot. It showed how pages of a book start as a large piece of paper and gets folded in half several times. Each time the sheet is folded, the number of pages double. So Greg took a piece of regular letter size paper, and he folded it in half 3 times, the way it showed in the encyclopedia. That one piece of paper turned into a chunky little 16-page book, Chunky Comics. It was so simple. But not really. Greg figured out that making little comic books was a 10-step process. Number 1, write a story that can be told on 12 to 14 mini comic book pages. Number 2, sketch, draw, ink, and then letter all 16 mini pages, which include the front and the back covers. Number 3, paste 8 of the mini page drawings into their correct position on a piece of paper to make master copy 1. A sheet that can be copied again and again. Number 4, paste up the other 8 mini pages to make master copy number 2. Number 5, using a copier, print the images from master copy 1 onto one side of a press sheet, a piece of regular size paper. Number 6, print the master copy 2 onto the flip side of the press sheet, making 8-page images on the front and 8 on the back. Number 7, carefully fold the press sheet with the 16 copied mini pages on it. Number 8, put in 2 staples along the crease at the very center of the little book between page 8 and 9. Number 9, trim the 3 unstapled edges, and that makes one finished mini comic book. Number 10, repeat. And each of the 10 steps had to be done perfectly, or no one would ever want to spend money on his chunky comics, on his little comics. After all the hows had been settled, well, then came the writing. But Craig hadn't written just one story. He developed a master publishing plan. Volume 1 was going to be about Creon, an incredibly intelligent Stone Age hero who helped his tribe with ancient dangers like prehistoric beasts and Cro-Magnon marauders. Greg figured that there could be like 7 or 8 issues with Creon. Chunky Comics Volume 2 would feature the future, where a superhero named Eon tried to protect a small colony of humans living in a world of melting ice caps and mutant life forms that were part human, part toxic sludge, and part recycled trucks and airplanes. Again, there'd be like 7 or 8 issues featuring Eon. And then Chunky Comics Volume number 3 would feature Leon, a fairly normal, modern age techno dude who suddenly finds himself energized with his digital atomic watch. When his digital atomic watch overheats and burns its circuits into the nerves on his wrist. Leon learns that the watch can be set for the future or the past. The 6 or 7 times travel adventure of Volume 3 would follow Leon to the past, where he would team up with Creon, and then to the future, where he would offer his services with the amazing Eon. And eventually, all 3 characters would have some final episodes together, Creon, Leon, and Eon, past present, and future. Now, once the master plan was set, writing the first crayon story, Return of the Hunter, well, that had been pretty easy for Greg, but the drawing was, well, it was more difficult than he had thought it would be. It had taken a long time to get each small page looking just the way he wanted. It wasn't like doodling or sketching. These pictures had to be good enough to sell. When both covers and the 14 inside pages had been drawn and inked and pasted in place to make the two master copies, Greg tackled his first printing. The copier that he had used was like his dad's, and it was actually part of the printer that was hooked up to the computer in the family room. It was an inkjet printer, just plus a scanner plus a copier, one of those all-in-one machines. It made copies in either black and white or color. Greg had stuffed about 40 ruined sheets of paper into the recycling bin before he had figured out how to get all 16 page images copied correctly on the front and the back of one sheet of paper. But finally, he had folded his first perfectly printed sheet, stapled it twice, and trimmed the top, front, and the bottom edges. And then, one hot night in the middle of July, Greg stood there in his family room and thumbed through the very first volume of Chunky Comics. Well, it had been a very proud moment. The end. All right, one thing that you'll see on the bottom left of page 492, it says author's purpose. A lot of the times, especially like on your M-Step test, they're going to ask you guys, well, what was the purpose of this writing? You got to remember, some human being wrote everything and anything that you read. And there's always a reason for writing it. What this story is doing, or the author of, your ELA book, they want to focus on the idea of author's purpose. So what's the purpose of this story? It says authors of fiction have different purposes or reasons for writing. They might want to share a theme, create realistic characters and plots, or simply entertain their readers, which the majority of fiction is for entertainment. To achieve their purpose, they develop the appropriate characters, events, settings, and other elements in their writing. By looking closely at the details in a work of fiction, you can understand the author's purpose. To determine the author's purpose in Lunch Money, examine the author's description of the main characters, the setting, and the plot events. What overall impression do these elements create? What is revealed through the details and story elements about the author's reason for writing this story? You can use graphic organizers like the one found on page 494 to help determine an author's purpose. And then the other two focuses from this story, you have voice, and then you have visual elements. So the idea of voice is, although Greg does not tell the story Lunch Money, the narrator reveals Greg's thoughts and feelings as if Greg himself is sharing them. To create a voice that is realistic, the author chooses the main character's words very carefully. Greg uses informal language such as come up with and deal, as well as short sentences. This realistic way of speaking brings out Greg's personality, and it makes his character convincing. So voice is basically a way to say kind of the personality. And then visual elements. Well, visual elements, authors of realistic fiction may use visual elements, such as graphic art and illustrations. These elements can help readers see what is happening more clearly, and they can also set the tone or feeling of the story. So that's kind of overall what visual elements are. All right, I hope you guys enjoyed Lunch Money and understood it, and comprehended it. And yeah, well done.